We have recently seen a huge shift in the budget cinema lens market, and you're now able to buy a set of cinema lenses for around the price that you would rent a more expensive set of cinema lenses in the past, and in the right situations and used in the right project, you wouldn't even be able to tell the difference. And I think this trend was really originated around 4 or 5 years ago by the DZO Vespids. These were the first ones that came out and people said, yeah, these are budget cine lenses, but they're absolutely good enough to use for paid projects. They're not just a toy. And then a few years later, NISI came out with their Athenas, which I think in many ways improved upon what the DZO Vespids did. Now, some people would still choose the Vespids over the Athenas, but the Athenas seem to be a bit sharper and a little bit more of a modern clinical lens. And now 7Artisans has entered the conversation with their 7Artisans Infinte lenses, and I think they are playing in the same game. If you're thinking about the DZO Vespids or the NISI Athenas, I think these are also worth considering. I will put some links in the description down below to the best prices I could find on the 7Artisans Infinte lenses and where you can get them, because they can be a little bit hard to find. I'll also put the best prices I found on the DZO Vespids as well as the NISI Athenas. And in full disclosure, these lenses were sent out to me at no cost to myself to allow me to make this video, but this is not a paid or sponsored video, and 7Artisans had no say in the making of the video. One place that people are often concerned about budget lenses is sharpness, and I would say these lenses are plenty sharp, and there was no situation or no bit of video that I shot where I said, oh, I wish this lens was a little bit sharper. We got some reasonably close shots of my face in a few different situations, and when we nailed focus, you could see the eyelash sharpness, you could see the pores on my skin, and particularly for me, I can't imagine any situation where I want a lens that is any sharper than what these lenses are. And as we look at the sharpness across all of the lenses, what I found is I didn't find one weak spot in the bunch, and I think this is super important. Sometimes you'll get a set of cine lenses released, and you'll have one lens that is weak, and then you've got to decide, is this set worth it because one of my favorite focal lengths isn't as sharp as the other or is noticeably softer. In this case, I found in all the real-world shooting that I did, you really couldn't tell them apart. They were all plenty sharp. But importantly, the 35 and the 50 were both plenty sharp enough and were really strong performers. And often when I'm looking at a set of cine lenses and their performance, these are the two that I'm looking at the most because they are the most commonly used focal lengths. And I think if you get a weak performance out of either of these, it can kind of be a deal breaker for the whole set. And they're not only strong performers in full frame mode, they're also strong performers in Super 35 or crop sensor mode. And as a rule, that is going to put more demand on the glass because you are going to be resolving more detail out of a smaller area of the lens. So these hold up in 4K footage or 6K footage, even in Super 35 mode. Now, I have not done any detailed comparisons, but just to check the sharpness, I took the 35mm NISI Athena lens and the 35mm 7Artisans Infinte lens, and I shot them on a test chart on a tripod next to each other. And what I found is that the sharpness was quite close and the contrast was pretty similar, but the NISI Athena was just that little bit sharper in the center of frame. As we went to the edge of frame, I thought they were quite similar. Interestingly, comparing the two, the NISI Athenas are VistaVision or larger than full frame sensor coverage, but when I shot the test chart, I found that they had noticeably more vignetting in the corners than the 7Artisans Infinte lenses. And the 7Artisans Infinte lenses do seem to be bigger, which makes you think they would have lower vignette. Now, they aren't marketing these lenses as VistaVision coverage, but I have a suspicion that they probably do have better coverage than full frame. Just having a look at the flare performance, the lenses are supposed to be designed to really control flare, and sometimes that is a worry for me because I don't want no flare in my cinema lenses. I want at least some soft, subtle flare that in the right situations, I can shoot somebody backlit with the sun coming through, and I don't want it to wash out the image, but I do want some lens flare dancing around and making the image look a little bit more interesting. And I think these strike a good balance depending on what sort of flare you're looking for, which is really just personal preference. But you don't have the images washing out or becoming desaturated. But what you do have is a little bit of lens flare dancing around. And I think in the right situations, you can bring that on and use that artistic element of the lens flare. But once again, this is all really going to be personal preference. The other thing that I thought is even shooting at T2.1, that was good enough to get a shallow depth of field in most situations, even when shooting in crop mode or Super 35 mode. I've shot with the NISIs at 1.9, I've shot with a lot of 1.4 lenses. I often find T2.9 or T2.8, I want a little bit more, but I did find at T2.1 in most situations, that is going to give you plenty enough shallow depth of field to isolate a subject if that's something you're looking to do. And even in reasonably low light situations, shooting with the Lumix S5 II, I did find, even though that isn't a great performer in low light, it was good enough in most situations. And if you're shooting with something like an FX3 or a ZVE1, one of the cameras that has Sony's crazy low light sensor that shoots 12,800 native, you're going to have absolutely no problem. T2.1 is more than good enough for those cameras. Overall, I found the lenses had reasonably good control of distortion, and I didn't think there were any images that looked crazy or weird. I was particularly surprised at the 16mm, how well it controlled distortion. Even when you got straight lines close to the edge of frame, there really wasn't much to see there, and I think that was a super impressive performance, and the 16 was definitely one of my favorite lenses in the kit. All the lenses showed a reasonably low amount of vignette. There was a little bit there, and you do get a little bit of character from that, but I don't think there are lenses that give you a whole lot of character from vignette. And this is really going to be personal preference, and I see this vignette performance more on the clean and clinical side. All the lenses render reasonably smooth and pleasing out of focus areas with generally round specular highlights or bokeh balls. The information I've received says that they have up to a 17-bladed iris, so I don't know if that means if some of them do or some of them don't, but this should mean that the bokeh balls remain generally round as you stop the iris down. The out of focus areas also seem to be generally consistent between the different lenses, and I didn't find switching from one to the other that I had significantly different bokeh balls or out of focus areas, which is great for keeping the shots looking consistent when swapping between lenses. One really important thing about cinema lenses is their ability to control focus breathing, and this was one of the problems with lenses in the past before the DZO Vespids and the NISI Athenas, was these cheap cinema lenses were really just rehoused photography lenses, and they often suffered from significant focus breathing. I think these 7Artisans Infinte series are right in line with the Vespids or the NISI Athenas. They control focus breathing exceptionally well, and I didn't have any situation really with any of the focal lengths that I thought it was going to ruin or change the shot. It was amazing how well controlled it was for a budget lens. All of the lenses are going to come with a push-on metal cap. They're also going to come with a plastic rear cap for PL or EF, depending on what you've chosen. The lens itself completely feels like a pro cinema lens. It's got an all metal housing. It has the geared aperture and focus ring, and these are the standard 0.8 pitch for the gearing, so standard across the board, going to work with most follow focus systems. The iris ring and the focus ring are both well dampened and really nice to use, and I think they strike a pretty well perfect balance between being too stiff and too loose. I did find between the set there were just the slightest variations in stiffness, but at the price point far from a deal breaker. The focus throw is a 330-degree focus throw, which is the longest of any of the budget lenses that I've tested. The NISI Athenas have a 300, and the DZO Vespids have 270. The only thing I'd say about this is it makes nailing focus, particularly with a follow focus system, very easy, but it does make it a little bit harder with that long focus throw when doing them handheld. You've got a little bit more incremental control, but if you're trying to do a longer focus throw, just that extra 30 or 60 degrees compared to the NISI or the DZO Vespids will make a little bit of a difference. At the time of making this video, there's going to be 7 focal length options in the 7Artisans Infinte series, and that is the 16, 24, 35, 50, 85, 105, and 135. Now, all of the lenses are T2.1, except for the 16 and 135, which are T2.4. The lenses are going to be available as individual lenses or in 3 different kit options. And as individual lenses, I think they're going to be a very similar price to the new pricing on the DZO Vespid lenses. Not the DZO Vespid 2, but the original ones, which they have just dropped the price on. They're also going to be available in 3 different kits. There's an Origin kit, which is going to give you a 35, 50, and 85. There's the Master kit, which is going to be a 24, 35, 50, and 85. And then they have the extension set for people that have already bought one of those first 2 and they want to add the less used focal lengths. That's going to give you the 16, 105, and 135. I actually think if you're somebody that shoots full frame and Super 35 sensor, either buying the Origin set with the 35, 50, and 85, or the Master set with the 24, 35, 50, and 85, and then adding the 16 millimeter is going to give you a lot of versatility, because that's a set that's going to give you the versatility to use it really well on full frame or Super 35 sensor cameras. The lenses are going to come in interchangeable P, L, and EF mount. That also allows you to easily adapt them to E, Z, RF, and L, so there's basically no camera system that you're not going to be able to use them on. A big part of using Cine lenses, particularly as a set, is having them as similar as possible, so you don't have to change things when you use them on a gimbal, or they all use the same filter thread or same matte box, and these are pretty good in that regards. The 24 all the way to the 105 are essentially the same size, and they're a very similar weight. The 16 millimeter lens is a little bit smaller, and the 135 is a little bit larger and heavier. All of them have 82 millimeter filter threads except for the 16, which has an 86. Importantly, they all have a 90 millimeter diameter for clamping on, clamp on matte boxes. I will have a deep dive detailed review covering all of these lenses, doing all of the tests, test chart images, vignette performance, flare performance, focus breathing. I'll have examples from every single lens. So stay tuned to the channel if you're interested in seeing that video. And in the meantime, if you're wondering how those NISI Athena lenses perform, another budget option kind of playing in the same ballpark as the 7Artisans Infinte lenses, I've just thrown that video on screen now. I made that video a little while ago, but there's a ton of real world examples of all kinds of different situations that you might want to use some budget cinema lenses in.